And we are live. I normally do a podcast, and I have this whole intro spiel that I do, but we're not doing anything like that tonight. I'm just hanging out with a couple buddies of mine, Chris and Ben. We might be joined by some other folks, and we're just going to talk a little bit about apologetics, counterapologetics, what we think of some of the arguments that have become sort of repopularized, and just the state of the conversation in general of what they call the Great Debate. But Chris and Ben, thanks for joining me, man.
Thank you. Oh, we're on air?
Yeah, we're on air now. So
okay, I got
we're going to oh, did you? Okay, we've had some connection issues and stuff. Crap. We're keeping it super casual tonight, guys. We're just kind of hanging out and talking. I don't think anybody really follows my personal channel, so we can't break this. And the odds of us even having any viewers on this are like zero. So we just we just lost him. That took seconds. So, Chris, what you been up to, man?
Dude, working. I just got off work.
Oh, yeah? Good deal. Yeah, I've been home for a couple hours, a little bit, and I thought I'd sit down and have a scotch and talk about religion. And Ben's back with us. Hey there.
My internet is.
We got you. Yeah, man. Are you on like a Wi-Fi right now, or are you
am.
online? You are.
I am on Wi-Fi.
You'll find a lot better fidelity, essentially, of your connection if you run a cable from wherever your router is. I actually run. I don't have to, but my router is in the other room. I have a 50-foot like Cat 5 cable, or whatever it is, the Ethernet cable that I run from like 2 rooms over, just so that I can have a better like call strength. So like when we are streaming and anybody hears it, like it doesn't get all choppy and screwed up. And you might, if you want to do more of these in the future, like it's worth investing the $25 or whatever it is.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind for next time for sure.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's this is real casual. We're not going to break nothing. Well, gosh, when we came in here, we started talking immediately about before we started recording about sort of just different arguments in our I don't know our scars from our interactions with the Capturing Christianity ministry. So I'll go ahead and say it. Man, I love Chris. I want to put his face up here. And he's over here laughing and cackling to himself. Yeah, that my basic take, and I said this in kinder terms. I think my within the last like 2 days of me being on that their Facebook page, that it's like, it's from what I've seen, they take the same this ministry takes the same classical arguments for the existence of God, essentially, or the truth of Christianity, and they haven't really repaired any of the flaws in any of the original arguments or any of the flaws that any of us see. And they just kind of slap a new coat of paint on it, and they present it in a like Shapiro-esque type argument where the idea is to make you sound ridiculous from the jump for disagreeing with them. And I didn't give it much credence. Like I was more interested initially in the conversations that they were going to try to have, because it's supposed to be like exposing the intellectual side of faith and this and that. And there are some highly educated people who are involved with that. And I don't want to besmirch them necessarily, but like there was nothing really new. And the fact that my conversations got bad with them, like it does in so many other apologetics pages or in relation to so many other ministries, I was like, it just left just very not impressed that it's the same snark and impish attitudes and condescension that you would see almost anywhere else. And so you guys like talking about these guys more than I do, honestly, because I sort of put the whole thing to my rudder a while ago. And yeah, so I gave up on that basically, and I'm friends with Ben Watkins, and I know he enjoys interacting with them, and he's a smart guy. He's been on my podcast for Many Opinions. He's been on my podcast a couple of times to talk about just different things going on also in politics, and then also in sort of like philosophy of religion. Really cool guy. I think he's a nicer person than me. I think is what it comes down to, because he has just more temperance for that kind of attitude, and I just don't. So I told, and I'll say it again here because it entertains me. one of the moderators, admins of the group, I was getting into a conversation with them, and he just got really pompous and obtuse and condescending, and I told him to go fuck himself. And that's because he wasn't interacting with my argument. He dismissed whatever the point was that I was trying to make, and saying, "Well, no, you just don't get it because you're too ignorant." Basically, how is that better for you, kind of thing? And I was like, "Go fuck yourself, man." And that was it. And that was like, I don't know how many months ago. And I wasn't going to give it another thought, but like, you guys really like talking about what they're doing. So this is probably more for you guys than it is for me. So
always entertaining.
Yeah. And it wasn't the main guy either. I want to point that out now.
It was
recording. It wasn't Cameron.
The enforcer stepped in.
Yeah. What's it? I don't know his name.
Alejandro.
It's something. Alejandro.
Yeah,
There it is.
Alejandro Morena.
That guy.
Moreno, yeah.
Which it was the funny thing is, I like up until that conversation, I actually liked him, but I knew he was a little bit, pompous and obtuse and stuff like that, and very verbose in the way he talks. For all that, I still kind of liked him a little bit better. And then like we had this one conversation, I was like, wow, it just exposed to me just what it was, just a shit at. Maybe he was having a bad day. I don't know.
But it's kind of half and half with him. I've seen him make some very well thought out.
Yeah. He's capable of some better things.
Yeah. I definitely didn't pick up that he was being disingenuous in any way with me.
Yeah. Well, good. It's but he was rude to me, and I'm going to take up for myself. And it's more important than their ministry or the rules on their page. And then so that was the decision I made. It was actually premeditated. I didn't respond just in anger. I was like, I think we're done here.
He's a dick. I'll say it.
There you go.
But I'm a dick too, so
right, yeah, we can all be those people. So of the two of you, are either of you actually still like in the page or whatever?
Yeah,
I got banned.
You got banned? Yeah, I think I knew I was going to be banned as soon as I said that. So I think I probably did get banned from that, and I left their little discussion group for whatever that's worth. But so Chris, you're banned.
Well, it's complicated.
You got a sock account? Is that what you're saying?
No. Alejandro took away my commenting privileges on the main page.
So you can still watch.
I can watch.
I think I can watch too. Like
Why would anyone want to watch that shit?
Right? Yeah.
And Alejandro took away my commenting privileges on a discussion we had, and I didn't cuss him or nothing. He just accused me of not telling. He accused me of lying, basically. Yeah. And he's dead wrong, and I'm right. But anyways, it was about history. And then like a few days later, Cameron took away my liking privileges because I was liking comments.
Oh, they didn't have that.
No, they didn't. So they took away those. But there's a private discussion group that they let me stay in, and I post there frequently.
That's weird. He's Cameron. Okay, part of me is like, I don't know why I want to keep giving airtime to somebody, like, and keep saying the name of somebody and drawing interest and attention and putting energy behind somebody who is, to my mind, not really giving, anything new to the discussion. But yeah, here we are. Maybe there's like a therapy session for us. I don't know. Which is really funny because that's what he suggested to me when I commented something once about like that. Basically, he shit posts. And then like I'll say something, he'll ask a few questions and then dip out of the conversation. So and someone like Alejandro will carry the torch.
You get
because he can't be bothered, right? Now I found that to be sort of like a disingenuous like bait and switch. I said something to that effect, and like I got messaged by some people about it, and like they're like, well, Cameron was like, well, why don't you go start a therapy group? Here you go, Cameron. This is our therapy group.
One's for you.
Anyway. So, but yeah, he's in some other pages that I think I'm involved with.
Yeah.
So I see him from time to time, but like I don't. Otherwise, I'm good. I'm busy with other stuff.
Well, the first time sorry. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's weird. Is I actually hope they are successful because I want to see him get to debates that I want to see him with. Like I want to see him in like a discussion with Bart Ehrman or someone of that caliber. Sean, I want to have him have Sean. I want him to get to the level where he can have Sean Carroll talk about the Kalam. like, between
Oh
them two.
man.
Yeah.
And let's just cut to the chase, right there.
I'm right there with you. Yeah.
And may the best man, bring the best points. I don't,
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's he's one that would not do well with like a Hitchens type, you know what I mean? Which I have my own criticisms of Hitchens, that there was a lot of heavy-handed rhetoric, and he wasn't truly the best debater, but he had such a way with words that, like, everyone in our little camp just loved that, and I think he would have put some pretty heavy zingers on the guy. But anyway, why don't we talk about if there's gonna be criticisms of the kind of arguments he's bringing, instead of just talking about them? Do we want to get into specifics of things that we see?
I got one.
Yeah.
So this is kind of what got me banned from the group.
Awesome.
And it'll happen in every apologetics group that you're in. Whenever any topic comes up that you're just guaranteed to get this argument. If you're playing bingo, this would be like the free space. Martyrdom of the disciples. How often have you seen this come up? It's they wouldn't have died for a lie and all that stuff. And I'm like,
yeah.
Really? And what is it that you think you know about how the disciples died? Please tell me.
Right.
All of these martyrdom stories. I'm happy to accept Paul. I think there's better sources for that. But the rest of them, all these stories about Peter being crucified upside down and things like this comes from 4th century church tradition. And so Cameron and I got into a little bit of an argument about that. He was trying to defend the martyrdom of James, Jesus's brother, and he pulls up Josephus, and there's this passage in Josephus, and it talks about Jesus and his brother James, and it's not clear that this is our Jesus. Those were 2 common names back then, but I'll just accept
sure.
This is our Jesus. Well, it says that James was brought before the Sanhedrin to be stoned for breaking the law, and that's the evidence he provides. So, I tell Cameron, like, that's pretty vague. Pretty sure anyone that's ever been stoned was stoned for breaking the law. Like, how are you reading martyrdom out of this? And I told him, how do you know he wasn't caught fapping on the Sabbath just, out of rhetoric?
Okay.
So he makes a shit post after this where he quotes me, and he says that I think that James, the brother of Jesus, was caught fapping on the Sabbath, and that's why he was put to death. Because that's what I said. I'm like, no, dude, that's not what I said. Like,
that's a really disingenuous straw man. That's
so bad. I'm sure you guys have similar stories.
Yeah, I don't have anything that specific. Like, I didn't get brought into a call out post basically that was like low key against you. Or against me rather in that case. But like, mostly just what I had seen is just the repetitions of, just bald assertions, right? By the way, Christianity is true. By the way, atheism is false. And they're intended to stir up controversy. And I'm like, I thought this was supposed to be about exposing the intellectual side of, the Christian faith, right? I'm like, and this is it. This is your shit posting for Jesus, and that's what's supposed to be. What draw? Because like I was expecting and hoping for the opposite, but that's not what's being presented, and it comes across as very two-faced. Because
by the way, I'm an intellectual,
right? Yeah. And it's like the idea is to draw people in, right? Because he knows how to Facebook, right? He knows how to get the people going. Knows how to get the conversation lively is by something provocative. Shapiro's really good at this. I draw a lot of analogy between himself and Shapiro and the way he presents himself in his arguments and things like that. I also don't like Shapiro at all, which you could probably guess because the analogy wasn't intended as flattering. And so like he gets people stirred up essentially, and tries to encourage people like us, the atheists, to, to pop back on that. So then we can have the debates that get drug out all into oblivion, where we're essentially held up to ridicule by the end of it. Just like you were essentially, by again in a Shapiro-esque fashion, misrepresenting what you said in order to make you sound ridiculous. And it's shameful behavior. It is always funny to me that this is supposed to be the virtuous Christian, and we're supposed to be the amoral or loving our sin, whatever the fuck, like atheist people. Like it just, the irony of that just strikes me over and over and over again, to the point where I know I can't take them serious when they try to present themselves as pious, moral, and just people. Like, just no, you're just winning on the internet.
I've never encountered anyone more eager to misunderstand.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Chris, what's up?
No, I love the page. I'm one of their biggest fans, man. I've shared so many of their posts in numerous groups and pages. I'll throw respect out there to the fact that his content's well done, and he's definitely good at thorough planning and being precise and stuff, like when his presentations. So I think he's but yeah, there's so many little things that I don't know. Daily, it's just like I'm fascinated by some of the arguments and stuff, and the way he goes about dodging questions.
Yeah, it's kind of like what I said. He'll make an audacious statement essentially, and then he relies on the people on his page to do the actual defense for the most part. He'll comment or two, and you see the dance being played essentially there. But he's trying to get the people. I run a Facebook page. I have a group. A lot of times, the way I interact with that stuff, it's to encourage participation essentially. I guess I just have a different end goal. And for me, it's trying to get people to have essentially in everything to have charitable conversations with each other and respect each other, despite their disagreements. And it doesn't seem like, to bring it back, this is I think a good way to highlight, I guess, the bright line between myself and Cameron and our approach to conversating about anything, whether or not it's apologetics, politics, whatever people are going to disagree about. For me, it's about essentially what I said is getting people to treat each other like human beings again. Because I think social media has made devils of us all. Essentially, we all act like jackwads on Facebook at some point or another. And yes. Cameron is an apologist, and apologetics is not for converting or convincing people who are outside the faith. It's for defending the faith amongst the faithful. That's what it is. And so when his posts stir up controversy and bring division, essentially, and are not about bringing people together who might have disagreements, it's about reinforcing the beliefs of the believers. When you look at it from that perspective, what he does makes sense. Some might argue whether, how much or how little that's, good Christian behavior or just moral behavior in general or ethical. It makes sense what he's doing from that perspective to me.
What's funny to me is it's just like, I don't know. It's like, I don't even know how to describe it's the background behind the thought of the page. I don't know. Go ahead, Ben. I'm trying to put it in words.
Well, it's just this.
It's okay. Nobody's watching us. We could sit here and bull honky for 4 hours. No one's going to care. This is just for us. It's fun.
Where the by the way whole thing, the BTW Christianity. Yeah. It's almost as if he's like trying to jump into something, drop an assertion, then get out of there like Attila the Hun, trying to fire a barrage of arrows and then get the hell out of there, so that he can't be counterattacked or something like that. I think that's very revealing of his thought process.
Right.
Oh, it's like lucky him, man. A lot of Christians are called to be a missionary in the Amazon. Think about the missionary who feels he's called to take his family to Syria, and try to win over ISIS and stuff. But Cameron is called to coffee shops and discussions. Someone, God has his ways, right? I mean, that's what I'm trying to say.
He was called to shit post on Facebook. That's right, and have a blog, and his blog is what I disagree with a lot of his arguments, obviously. But it's a well thought out blog. It's good production quality for all the stuff he does. Don't want to besmirch that, but like that was his calling to do that.
That's
to preach to the choir in a place where he's safe.
like who doesn't want that job? I mean,
Right.
hell, I'll convert back if I could get that job. Yeah, I'll take $45 a year to do that. Go around to conferences and watch William Lane Craig and take notes. Try to get selfies afterwards and advancing the kingdom.
And I knew it was a problem when, after being active on Cameron's page for so long, people on the Reasonable Faith page started seeming so reasonable. It was just nuts.
Right.
I knew something was up at that point.
Yeah, it's there's an interesting thing here that and I have to, and this is me just being circumspect, really, that we're all sort of venting a little bit on Captain Christianity and some of the bad behavior we've seen, and I think most of it is very well explained by tribalism, right? Why we're here talking about it right now, and why they're doing what they're doing essentially, and actually a former member of the page as well, a guy named Richard Suttles, who's a friend of mine, and he's actually been a guest on my podcast on the topic of tribalism. Surprise, surprise. Who also didn't like Alejandro and broke off bad with him, not as colorfully as I did, but still broke off bad with him and ended up leaving the page on his own terms, I believe. Most all of this behavior is explicable, through the lens of tribalism, that they're defending their camp and we're defending ours, right? And they'll pick and prod at the things we say, and we're going to pick and prod at the things that they say. And it's to reinforce each camp, and that's really what again, this is, like I said, it's what apologetics comes back to, is defending your own team and doing what you can to slight the other. But I think the problem for all of us, and again, this is where I come back to trying to be circumspect with myself, is that am I just misreading their comments? Am I misunderstanding something based on my presumption of bad intentions on their part? Like, I have to ask myself that. To me, I know there are cases where I've done that. I don't know, with regards to my interactions with them, if that's been true, because I've tried to be a little bit more, I don't know, quote unquote, woke about the fact that we all engage in biased reasoning, that the fact that we're all a bit tribalistic, and depending on how important whatever that tribe or team is to you, you're going to be more tribalistic in its defense because it's closer to your sense of self-identity and self-worth, right, in your place in the community. So the more important it is to you and to your ego, essentially, the harder you're going to defend it, and the more hostile you're going to be to the other team. Is it possible, in this moment, that we are engaging in that kind of tribalism of misreading and misinterpreting what may be sincere intentions on their parts, even if it is as plagued by by biased and motivated reasoning and tribalism on their part as well? Like, are we all just kind of feeding that? What do you guys think?
I mean, for me, I don't know about you guys, I'm genuinely seeking a way back to the church since leaving.
Really?
I really am. Like, I'm really testing. I'm looking for hard arguments that I can understand. I've found a glimmer of hope in the Catholic Church. I was raised to think they were the devil, coming from Baptist and then Presbyterian. But
that's really funny.
The way that they interpret the scriptures loosely and acknowledge the true history of it, I respect that, and it makes a little more sense to me that you don't have to take the Bible so word for word, But then there's so many other things I just can't get on board with.
Right. Yeah. To me, it's like, wouldn't we all rather there be an afterlife? Wouldn't we all rather, have our consciousnesses like exist forever and we could be with our loved ones that we lost and, be happy in paradise for eternity? Wouldn't we all prefer that to, death and annihilation or suffering or whatever, version of this you want to look at? Like, wouldn't we rather? Of course I would rather. Of course everybody would rather. Or just about everybody. But like that's not enough for me to get to it being true, right? Just because I want a thing. And just because it's been culturally reinforced doesn't really interact with whether or not it's true or not. Right. We've come to these beliefs because they're beneficial to us and they're beneficial to the functioning of a society. They've given, because of this, really, and you can't ignore it. There's a moral framework that arises around it that you better be good in this life or you're going to be punished down the line, right? When you're going to be judged for the things you do, so you better act right now. Whether or not that's true, that's effective, right? If you're worried about your eternal disposition, like that's going to be an effective way to, motivate the what is deemed societally as the proper behavior. So like it makes sense on those terms. And again, that refers back to, this is a tribalistic thing. This is, the God virus, essentially, to borrow a little bit from Daryl Ray there. That's, and that's how it propagates and how like religion feeds into society and society loops back into religion. And, they've been working hand in hand in a way that's generally beneficial to civilization. But I think now we're reaching an age of, basically since the age of enlightenment, that we're growing beyond that a little bit. And we don't really need or rather, okay, I won't even say this, that we don't need it, but that we're realizing that, one doesn't necessitate the other. The fact that, we act more or less good, according to societal standards, being a beneficial thing to society doesn't correlate with, what's going to happen to you if you're not, having any truth in reality. Right. And that's where I sit with it. That's anyway.
Well, I think you had a good point there about the framework of wanting to, avoid punishment in hell, so you don't do bad things. But I think a lot of that gets negated by the contemporary evangelical theology that's pushed. That's our good deeds are like dirty rags before the Lord, and none of us does any good. We're all wicked sinners. It's by grace that you obtain the salvation. If they ever did have a footing of moral superiority over an unbeliever, well, we want to avoid punishment or we want to go to heaven. It seems that such a theology just puts us right back on equal footing again.
Yeah, because we're all basically shit. Like,
yeah, that
people.
Sorry, like I'm not here talking to some Christian apologist. Like, I'm not gonna, I try. It's a funny thing. I'll go on a segue just for a second. Like when I interact with those people in those situations, I don't just constantly like berate and act ugly. I kind of respect sort of like their thing. Try not to say things that get their hackles up, right, or get them clutching pearls because I'm being like gross or foul. Like I really try to be respectful, but like don't return that to me. I'm going to stop wasting my time doing that.
Oh, that's where.
But generally, we're here. We're all filthy atheists. We're all going to go to hell. So like, yeah. So anyway, the idea that basically we're all shit. That I don't know if that's called Molinism or whatever, but it's sort of.
It's Calvinism for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely true within Calvinism. It's one of the 5 points. But that we're all doomed to hell if you do even the slightest, tiniest thing, right? That's wrong, and we're all just going to do that because that's our nature. Then we deserve hell, whatever that small, minor thing is, and that's why we need to be saved. And that's a fun, like, gotcha anyway kind of thing. But I don't think most people who call themselves evangelicals really live like that's true. Okay. And it doesn't necessarily speak to that it's falsity, but I don't think very many people, like we're breathing really rare air by talking to people who are apologists who are engaged in the arguments all the time, who are on social media all the time, arguing with people about these things. This is a particular breed, and I don't think it's representative of the population because, and really, where I live, I live in, deep South essentially, and it's heavily evangelical, heavily Church of Christ. I know these people. I see the way they act. They don't live like that's true. They just don't. Because they all basically want to be good people. They want to love God. They love Jesus, and they want to do right in the world. And they follow, that doctrine. In my opinion, too strongly and too closely. But they're trying to do the right thing, and they don't think of themselves as trash or filth or worthless or any of those things that come along with. I believe it's Molinism. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's part of the doctrine. It's not necessarily Calvinist, but it's definitely true within Calvinism. That really hold to that. That doesn't interact well with the reality of their lives and the way because no one walks around all day every day thinking I'm trash, I'm shit, I'm worthless, I'm useless. Thank you, God, for making me less so essentially. And if you do, please. I feel bad for that person if that's really all they think of themselves.
Yeah, I wouldn't pretend to know that they really do or don't believe that necessarily, but I was just commenting more on the official doctrine of the
Sure.
organization of their churches. They probably don't act like people who actually believe that, but I do just find that a bit ironic.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. I don't know.
I want to segue into
Go ahead.
something if
Do it.
you guys don't mind. The one thing that irritates me most about Cameron in particular, but this is just my experience. I kind of locked onto that page by accident when he first got it started, and I've watched it kind of grow. And I see the influence he has on all the guys under him. So he says he interprets a passage one way, and then I start seeing it in all the other groups from these same guys. And I guess I'm guilty of the same thing, the things I believe, but it's just, and here's what I'm getting at: the Old Testament, and mostly the Old Testament atrocities or the alleged Old Testament atrocities. If you're an apologist,
right.
It infuriates me that how most of the modern apologists interpret, but particularly Cameron just refuses to go into it. It's like a non-issue. It's a non-issue to him. It's no point. Move on.
I saw
he
that
just shuts it down.
I saw that with your engagement with him, and I think it was back. This is a while ago. And it's not. Again, let's normalize this out. This is not just Cameron. This is not just capturing Christianity. That I see this a lot amongst, modern day evangelicals, and particularly in the apologetics community, that they try because they know it's not really a winning argument, right? To go into basically either divine command theory or there is, what do they call it, like skeptical theism, that there is some greater good achieved by this, and you just don't know what it is, essentially. To take either of those tracks, which are not really effective at all, to someone who's not already on your team, right? Or it's, basically stiff arm the entire conversation and try to take it, try to bring it back to, the New Testament and Jesus, which it's an obvious ducking of the issue. Because if the Bible is supposed to be the word of God and inerrant, he said some fucked up shit, right? In the Old Testament. That's really supposed to be the word of God. Like, the slaughter of the Amalekites and Midianites, the wiping out of these people. You can come with an argument, right? You can, saying why it's justified or all those babies are in heaven now. And, it's actually really interesting. And to mention, again, my podcast, Fermenting Opinions, I had two guys on who were former Church of Christ. They were both, they both became atheists. They were members of Recovering from Religion. And they both got disfellowshipped and effectively disowned by their families, like their parents and their, not all of, but a large portion of their extended families as well, their birth families. They're both married and they have spouses that are a little bit more liberal, I guess, about their faith. But like, the argument is there in those cases, because when a person who's struggling with their faith, they encounter an argument like this, and there's a moral outrage, right, that you experience. You're saying that the omnibenevolent, perfect, just God. Ben, you're on there twice. So, whoa. Okay, I guess maybe Ben dropped out and then rejoined.
Yeah.
So you got Ben's got a stuck face, and then another.
It's like some Rick and Morty.
I mean, if God exists, then all things are possible. So,
Is that what we're on now?
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
I was talking about Old Testament atrocities, and the fact that this is something that sticks in atheist craw like all the time. It always comes up. In 1 Samuel 15:3, there's a bunch of other verses about the slaughtering and killing of people who were against God, essentially, and how it's justified. And one of the arguments that was that came about with one of these friends of mine who were guests on my podcasts, talking about these Old Testament atrocities, and essentially God killed a bunch of babies or ordered them killed, is that those babies were in heaven now, and that actually caused one of their fathers to reconsider his stance on abortion, because seriously, if you guys don't listen, I think it's like season 2 episode, I think it's 19, is like, it's called Disfellowship and Disown, and he gets into that. One of the guests gets into that a little bit, saying that essentially, well, if those babies were just all killed while they were still sinless, because he's not a Molinist, not a Calvinist. I'll say Calvinist. I think it's Molinism is the idea that you're born automatically in sin, kind of thing, whether or not you've actually done anything. So even as a baby, you're still supposed to go to hell. If I'm applying the accurate term to that, that's what it is. Essentially, because he's not that even an aborted baby will automatically go to heaven. So it's really not that bad, because that means they don't get to grow up into this filthy world and become a sinner and probably not repent in the true church, quote unquote, which is obviously whatever church they're a member of. Then that's actually a net good that all these babies are being aborted.
Let's kill all the babies then.
So let's kill all the babies.
That's where that line of reasoning leads you.
Look, I swear that I think that argument all the time, but guys they won't even entertain it. They think it's so ad hoc, but it's really not.
Because it's justified the argument for like the crazy mom who like drowns her kid in their car by pushing it into a lake, kind of thing, like, or letting it roll into a lake. Like, you've justified that person's behavior because now you've killed those little kids before they could sin and be worthy of hell, right? And I think it makes me wonder, because you said it being ad hoc, that maybe that this sort of doctrine essentially came about in response to that argument that, like, well, if you murder your kids as babies, then they're automatically going to heaven, and don't you want your kids to go to heaven? If they live long enough, they're going to risk hell, right? They could become atheists like us. They could become an unrepentant sinner of some variety, right, and go to hell.
Exactly. What if you run the risk of them being atheists and going to hell forever? So you're doing them a disfavor by not supporting abortion, right? Why risk it?
And it's from us super facetious, right, to even say that. Yeah. But like, follow the logic. Follow what the argument says. Follow that doctrine. It leads you to a dumb fucking place, right? Because that's essentially what you're able to justify. So like, which might be why this Calvinist type argument really came about.
Speaking of
I won't say it came about, because I'm sorry, I'll let you go in a second, Ben. But like, it might came about, but why it's maybe like being repopularized essentially, or why it gets employed in response to that. Because there's always some doctrine, some theory, some argument, and they become popular and then they fade away for a while. And that might be why we're seeing, a resurgence of that. Essentially is what I'm getting at. But go ahead, Ben.
Well, I was just going to comment on. So you brought up the idea of the Old Testament atrocities.
Mm-hmm.
I think that probably the most ironic thing about that is that the apologists that we're talking to about that these are people who are constantly trying to ram absolute morality down our throats all the time, and objective moral standards. But then all of a sudden, when we bring up the atrocities of the Old Testament, now everyone's a relativist all of a sudden. Well, where did that come from?
Right. Yeah. They attack you, basically. They attack you. Say, Oh,
That was a different time back then.
You guys talking about, slaughtering babies and for whatever fucking reason, farm animals, right? Like it's scorched earth all the way on the Amalekites. And if you say, Jesus, that's really fucked up. Like why would a loving God command such a thing? And then they say, basically, how dare you, A, to judge God, because that was totally God and not a person trying to justify their war maneuvers. And B, what is your standard for even being upset, right? Because you're an atheist.
Yeah.
Right. Why do you even care? What does it matter? You're just fizz and all that shit, right?
Yeah. Your protoplasm bag.
And the thing here, and this is a good point to talk about, like real like counter apologetics, that like when that occurs right at that moment, this person's deflecting, right? By basically attacking you as an atheist or non-believer. Something about you or your character. This is essentially an ad hom, and it's a way to deflect from the question and not have to answer it.
But Cameron knows this. He's a step ahead. He knows that.
Which is why we don't even have the conversation in the first place.
His cronies, some of his weaker-minded cronies, as I call them on the page, go into everything you said. But right. Cameron just dismisses the argument from the start. He doesn't even get into it. He says it's hyperbole. It's Jewish war text. They didn't mean that. And plus, I've had Alejandro expand and tell me the Israelites would march on, say, Jericho. It was like this little fortified structure. And all the women folk and kids would run to the hills. And the men folk would stay and fight it out in this bastion. But if you study through history, that's not the case. The people live in the countryside and then come down to the fortifications when armies come in to attack. Right. And William Lane, I even had to go as far as putting William Lane Craig direct video clips of him saying, and I don't think they slaughtered literally every kid, but they did probably kill some kids. But the real issue was drive them out of the land. It wasn't so much commit genocide. That's fine. That's enough damning.
That sounds so much better, right?
I've heard him say,
that's what I'm saying. At least 10 babies got slaughtered. That's still evil.
I've heard him say a separate little speech thing. No, these people were so evil that they needed to be completely wiped off the face of the earth. Which is it?
Yeah.
And the funny thing about that is that some of these people are still alive. There are still Canaanites. So what does that say to them? I'd be pretty pissed off if I was one of them.
In the last 2 years, William Lane Craig put a video where he expounded on that, and he says, I've come to now see the text means more that it was a command to drive them out. It wasn't so much to the letter, literally, like go hunt every last one of them down. It was drive them out, and the ones that fled. But he does admit that there was some percentage of children put to death, in the aftermath of the battles. And then he gives his divine command theory.
We've got a viewer, guys. I don't know how the hell that happened. I don't know who the hell's viewing this, but hi. We're talking about the slaughter of the Amalekites because that's all atheists can talk about.
And the Jebusites and the Perizzites.
Right, yeah, and the Midianites.
And the Canaanites. And think about how many mentally ill people had to be put down. I mean, it's a real issue to me. You can't just dismiss it. I mean, that's, and I refuse to back down from that.
Sure. No, it's extremely. I used to be a big fan of like the Dogma Debate podcast back when they did more like apologetic stuff and less like politics, and the guy Smalley being like a center lord, whatever. I don't know how much you follow these guys, but whatever. I used to be like a diehard fan. I went to the Dillahunty Psi 10 debate, which was moderated by David Smalley, and I bought a T-shirt at the thing at the event. That's I'm an atheist because I've read it referring to the Bible, and on the back it has the 1 Samuel 15:3 about the slaughter of the Amalekites. Because to me that was the slam dunk, right? On God being this perfectly moral and just is like you have to ruin the definition in normative terms of what it means to be decent and good, to other people. If you're okay with this kind of behavior, but that's exactly what the apologetic defense suggests that you're supposed to just void all of that because you're not that good in the first place. So you need to go by with what God says, and if God says this, then therefore it's good, right? That's essentially, divine command theory. And if you can't just sit back right at that moment and say, "You guys have lost the fucking plot," right? When it comes to, we've got 2 viewers now. I'm starting to worry.
How is it?
I don't know who the hell's watching this. Who's gonna watch me talk about religion? Because most people, I used to be fair because I came up like basically learning arguments and debate and whatever you want to call it, debate, Facebook debate, talking, apologetics, counter apologetics, fighting the Christian apologist on the internet kind of thing. And that's, I was very well versed in all the arguments and, maybe less so now. And then I ended up segueing into politics, right? And that became sort of my bread and butter, right? So like, I really enjoyed this stuff. But like, I don't know anybody who would still have, from the days where I just had my own YouTube channel and like 1 or 2 videos in grand total regarding this stuff. Anybody would still be paying attention to this stuff. I don't know who's following me on YouTube. So we've got 2 viewers. It's weird. But hi, people. Thank you for being there. Maybe I'll get some messages or something about it. We'll see. Anyway, so yeah. So like the Old Testament atrocities, like I don't know. There are theodicies. There are apologetic defenses that I think fail. There's a slight combo. It's okay. That fail anybody who isn't looking for a reason why they should continue to think that their beliefs are okay as Christians, right? That if you're not already in that camp, you're not really going to be persuaded, I don't think. I don't know anybody who's been converted or had their mind changed about any argument to defend those kinds of passages like myself and Chris were just talking about. And yeah, so like you said, I think Cameron and a lot of other apologists wisely sidestep the issue as much as possible because there's no way to get into that conversation without looking bad. To reference this back to politics, it's like the Brett Kavanaugh hearing where, Kavanaugh was asked, were you a sloppy drunk? Did you ever get blackout drunk? And he didn't want to answer. Like, and he would be like, well, did you? Have you ever gotten blackout drunk? Have you, like, who are you to judge me kind of thing? Like, and how much is too much? Well, what's the legal definition of inebriated? Whatever the law says, da da da. Like, he just fucking dances around it. He doesn't want to say it. He doesn't want to own it because there's no version of that answer that's going to make him look good, right? Because, well, we know he did that shit, right? And so I look at that as sort of the same kind of game that's being played. And it's just, in that arena, it's politics rather than religion. But yeah, what do you guys think? I can talk at length about everything. So
regarding Kavanaugh, I think Bayes' theorem pretty much shows that he did it. I don't know how well versed in Bayes' theorem you guys are.
I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you get your prior probability, and for the benefit of the audience, if they don't know what Bayes' theorem is, just a method of finding out what probably happened, and you start with a prior probability that's based off background knowledge. Then you factor in the evidence, and the evidence will move it up or down based on that prior probability. But if most rape allegations are true, if there have only been 10 rape allegations in the world, and 9 of them were true and 1 of them were false, that means and the next one that happens on background knowledge alone is going to be a 90% chance of being true. So then if you have evidence that comes after that, it goes either up or down. Well, in Kavanaugh's case, even if you want to call the evidence a complete wash, maybe it could be politicized, but then again, there's multiple testimony that cancels out. That just leaves you with a prior probability. You probably did it.
Yeah, that's I think that's a pretty succinct way of putting it. I think there's something statistically about like something possibly up to about 10% of rape allegations or sexual assault allegations are false or spurious. So yeah, so based on that alone, makes it more likely. Because considering all the factors, right? We just did an episode on this yesterday. Actually, I haven't edited it to put it in podcast format. About a woman who came forward about being sexually harassed and abused basically throughout her life, and how it led to addiction and all these other horrifying things that she had to deal with. And those experiences are very real. And it's like, well, but can you prove it? Can you prove it? It's like, no, you can't, because really all we have in terms of, because it's been so many years, all you have is this person's testimony versus this other person's testimony and little bits of indirect evidence that will corroborate or not corroborate. And this is a really funny tangent. I mean, Kavanaugh perjured himself like up and down. So his testimony is immediately less reliable. And like you said, like Bayes' theorem, like between that and Bayes' theorem, like it's, and we can't know in the strict epistemic sense, but like if we're going to reach, come to an inductive inference based on the information available, yeah, he did it. And yes, she's telling the truth. And no, he's not fit for the Supreme Court or any court. But yeah, really interesting segue, because I apparently cannot stop talking about this subject.
Man, I haven't dug in deep like you guys, but I can't get away from it. It's everywhere. It's really polarizing.
It's ubiquitous.
And here's something I want to harp on, because I don't really know where I stand on it. I'm waiting for more evidence. But here's something I run through my head. Put yourself in the lady's, is it Dr. Ford? Yeah. Put yourself in her shoes. Why is she bringing these allegations? Let's run through the list. What are the possible scenarios that are at play here? One, she's telling the truth.
Right.
Two, she's lying. Okay, that's really the two, but lying has caveats on it. So if she's lying, why is she lying? Is she getting paid? Well, in today's world, that paper trail will show up and be exposed. That's a big risk. Plus, the backfire she's taking and will continue to take for doing this, is it worth it? It has to be worth it. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
Or the third option is she's crazy herself. She has a personality disorder, a narcissist, something, I don't, whatever.
Right.
Something that craves the attention, is feeding off of this, no matter the cost. And those are really the only couple options. And which one is more likely? Let's put Occam's razor there, or
sure,
whatever.
Yeah, to me, it's very much a matter of Occam's razor. Is it someone who's come forward at the risk to herself with any like potential for personal gain from this being sort of minimal and outweighed by the risks essentially of death threats. She's had to leave her home. All these things that are coming out against her, but really just to, and she didn't want to be public about it. And that was one of the things I watched the hearings. Like, she did not want to be public about it. When Kavanaugh made the short list, before he was even nominated, when he made the short list, she came out to Feinstein saying, I don't want my name in this, but this is the thing that happened to me because of him. And he's a bad pick. You want to push back against him. You don't want him out there. You should basically, I guess, float this without getting into me specifically. The story anyway, somebody leaked some shit to the press afterwards, and then her name was out there with stories that were bogus essentially, and she had to come out fully in order to get in front of those misleading stories basically about her. And that's why she was where she was. Versus Brett Kavanaugh, who, it's really funny we're still talking about this because we were supposed to be
You're on the air.
We are on the air. Versus Brett Kavanaugh, who can admit that he was a drunk jock asshole in high school and college because so many people, and I grew up in the very same area. I went to a sort of a preparatory like Catholic elementary / middle school called Holy Trinity, which is in Georgetown. A good deal of the people who graduated from went on to either Georgetown Prep, where Kavanaugh went, or Gonzaga, or DeMatha, I think, and a couple other places. The girls went to like Visitation and other kind of similar, like all-girl Catholic schools that were prep schools, and there's very, Ivy League adjacent type things. And I went to school with, the sons and daughters of ambassadors and CEOs and what have you that were located around like sort of the nexus of power in DC. I won't say so much of the girls, but of the boys, they were almost invariably jackasses, right? Entitled, rich, spoiled, very fitting to the characteristics that are being attributed to Kavanaugh. But that was like middle school, so it was like pre getting your hands on alcohol or any significant alcohol. The way he would have acted is very consistent with what I knew, still being in that area, even though I didn't go on to those schools in high school. Like, again, just sort of. If it's true, it fits pretty well with what I know about that area and the culture in that area, even though I was in school like 10 to 15 years later after Kavanaugh. That doesn't change. The culture doesn't change that much that quickly, or at least it didn't in that case. That pattern of behavior fits very, very well with me. His yearbook corroborates it. His calendar corroborates it. I guess he had some kind of journal or some letters or some shit came out like 1983, 84, corroborates essentially that sort of demeanor towards alcohol and towards women generally, not necessarily like the rapey bit, but like he's there to get girls kind of thing. Because that's the age and that's the culture and that's what boys do in that situation. And the fact that he denied all of that and try to paint it up as this Renate alumnus, whatever. That's I had the honor of dancing with her, and that was such a just a nice thing to uplift her and like obvious fucking bullshit. Like Ralph King of Beach Week, and he says it's because he has a weak stomach and like spicy food will make him throw up. Are you fucking kidding me? Like, who the fuck's going to believe that for 5 seconds? Who bought that shit is what I want to know.
And yet some people in society will believe that over the victim.
Right, yeah, over the victim who came forward at essentially, great personal peril and really not getting anything out of it. Like, that's what we're holding up to. But, like, again, what tribe are you in? Are you in the tribe that hates the liberals and Democrats? Because you want to believe Kavanaugh and everything he says, right? You want to believe Lindsey Graham and his grandstanding. I don't know if you heard or seen that. I watched all of the hearings that Thursday. I was actually off work. And I watched him and I was like, his eyes are brown. He is so full of shit right now. His eyes are brown. But again, maybe that's my tribalism speak. I don't think so. I don't think the facts support anything he was saying or anything Kavanaugh was saying. That's what skepticism is about, guys. Anyway, I talk a lot. Somebody else talk, please.
I want to talk about why it's important to believe the victim. Why is it the case that most true rapes are not reported? What's the reason there? It's because society doesn't take them seriously and often blames them.
Right.
So, they have to relive this horrible experience again and everything that goes along with that just to be blamed. Now, to think that someone's willing to go through all of that and accept blame from society, when it didn't even happen, it's just, I'm not going to say that can't happen, but the cases are far and few between.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. And I did a podcast episode on this yesterday. It's on my Fermenting Opinions YouTube channel. We had a woman sit right here and talk about being assaulted and why she didn't report at the time, because there's this perception of, I wasn't going to have this conversation again. We're supposed to talk about apologetics, guys. But basically that, she wouldn't have been believed. She had no way of proving it. And it was his word against hers. And if she went to go ride in a car with a boy in the first place, she was already a slut, right? And a slut can't be sexually assaulted because they want it, right? She broke the rules, the purity rules, essentially. And she during our interview, she listed those in great length about all the things that a woman has to do in order to not be, quote unquote, asking for it. And if she fails any of those, and if something happens to her, it's her fault. And then that's why she doesn't report. And then if she waits to report it later or say something later, then she's not believed because then she waited. And it's just every time, every way this thing breaks, it's always the woman's fault. It's always the victim's fault.
Yo, check this out to piggyback on that. this even goes back to the Old Testament. Have you guys, for y'all familiar with the passage that talks about a woman being raped in the Old Testament law?
Yes.
And if she doesn't
Well,
scream out loud enough, if she doesn't
That is her
scream out
fault.
loud enough, then she is also guilty of sin or stained or whatever sin.
Right, and gets stoned to death.
Yeah. Think about that. You telling me some men didn't write that?
You mean an all-wise being doesn't understand consent?
Right. Yeah. And it's not even that she didn't scream out; it's that no one heard her scream out. Right. I mean, because that's all they have to work with. In that situation, you don't know if that woman screamed out if you were not, in the physical vicinity of that happening. Right. And all the guy can say is that she didn't scream out, so she must have wanted it.
It's like if she doesn't fight, hard enough and scream bloody murder.
And this is why misogyny is hard coded into our culture because of, quote unquote Judeo-Christian values, right? This is the Abrahamic morality is still echoing into the 21st century. That men have this attitude towards women of they broke the rules that we wrote, right? And that we don't have to live by. So it always comes back to being the woman's fault. And it goes all the way back, just like you said. I can't remember if that's, I won't try to say what book it was in, but I recall it from the Old Testament. I remember reading it myself.
I think it's Leviticus.
Leviticus. Leviticus is a fun book, isn't it? Yeah. There's lots of juicy stuff in there.
Man, people should really read their Old Testament. Like, just start from the beginning and read. It's amazing what you'll probably have skimmed over in the past. Even for me, growing up in the church, coming out of it, I started reading it more and more, and it's like, holy cow, how did I miss this? I
think that's an interesting thing is that as I was raised as a Catholic, and we were never really particularly strongly encouraged to read, especially the Old Testament, but really just read the Bible at all. That we were taught principles and I went to Catholic school for like 8 or 9 years in grand total in my life. At no point was there any sort of extensive kind of Bible study that goes on. And that led me to my own sort of exploration of the text, my own exploration. But just like the T-shirt I told you that I had, the Dogma Debate shirt, I'm an atheist because I've read it. Like I read Genesis and that made me an atheist. Like I had a lot of questions, things weren't making sense, things I was balking at, morally. And I read Genesis and I was like, this reads like, like the Iliad or, some Sumerian myth or something, something from the Greek pantheon. Like this is, I can line these up side by side and they all, look more or less like each other. Like these are just people trying to make sense of why they're here in the first place. And here's a story they crafted about it. And that's because just hilariously unreal things that they talk about in the Bible. Even and especially in Genesis, I read that. I was like, this isn't real. Like this isn't real. And it's not necessarily warranted to conclude that you should be an atheist just because you read one holy book basically and decided it wasn't real, because that doesn't discount the others. But I was, I think, in the 7th grade at the time. And like, that's where I was right then, And I just
found your way out early then.
I just applied that same argument to other faith traditions, as I grew older and became aware of them. Like I don't have any more reason to believe in any of these other stories than I do this one. And oftentimes when you examine whatever those arguments are, you have good reasons to reject them outright. And I don't know how you guys, like, if you want to get into like the how do you define atheism thing, and split those hairs for the next 3 days, we can do that. But essentially I look at this stuff, I say, nah, I don't think that's real. I don't think it corresponds to anything in reality. That's why that's why I'm an atheist. But yeah, and I did, to go back to what you were saying, Ben, I got out of it early because I had questions early, and questions I never had good answers to. And to go back to what you were saying, Chris, that like we didn't do like the Bible study. We weren't told what we were supposed to think about these verses from some early age because we didn't really explore it. But if I grew up in a faith tradition that was probably more evangelical and a lot more hands-on with the text of the Bible, maybe that wouldn't be the case. Maybe if I was taught from, since I could, old enough to read, basically, or that, this is what's supposed to be, I'm supposed to think about this verse. This is what I'm supposed to think about that verse. It would be very difficult to change my thinking on it. Because it would have been ingrained, since, 6 or 7 years old, essentially, right? That this is what these things mean. This is how I'm supposed to look at this. And it would never occur to me to think of, like the story of Abraham and Isaac, or the flood, or, the Amalekites as, as moral atrocities. Rather, there's supposed to be some good moral teaching from it that's supposed to guide my life, right? Because if that was enforced upon me, before I was old enough to be of the age of reason and think about whether or not they were moral atrocities on my own terms, I may be a Christian today,
Yeah, I was read the children's Bible as a young kid, and recently I am an uncle.
Oh yeah, congratulations, by the way, for your, I guess.
Oh, we lost it.
Oh, did you chop out again? I saw a little blip. Ben, you got to get that cord, brother. I guess he's gone. Maybe he'll come back. Chris, when did you become an atheist, Chris?
Well, in one sense, I don't think of myself as an atheist.
Oh,
I'm more agnostic.
I actually didn't know that. Okay, that's good.
Sorry, I got dropped
that's
out.
Okay. Yeah, you cut out. Yeah, I ended up switching to. We're gonna let Chris finish here, though.
Sure.
I don't know. I was just saying I'm more agnostic than atheist. At this point, though, it's hard for me to believe Jesus was any God. I think he existed. I believe he was a Jewish Pharisee, a rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he kind of split off a little bit with his teachings and had a following and got himself crucified by the Romans. So, but I can't really see the divine in it.
Yeah, I guess in terms of how you look at scripture, I guess I would say that I'm not. Oh, we lost you on camera there. It's not,
Sorry.
No, it's okay. That I guess I wouldn't place myself all that different about it, but I guess I don't know the atheist agnostic distinction. I don't know if that's something you want to get into.
It's really never been an issue for me. I'm actually pretty generous in that argument. Like, I used to get upset and feel like people trying to put the burden of proof on me, saying you're an atheist, defend it, and it's like, no, I don't have anything to defend. But I've listened to guys like Ozymandias, and a few others, and
I'm a big fan of his, by the way.
Same here, and I've done a little bit of reading on it from scholarly stuff, and it does seem to be the case that it is a belief or an assertion of no God or gods,
Yeah. And is it because that's a burden of proof that you don't want to take on, or is it because you really, and see that's because people talk about agnosticism differently. Like, if you're just saying, I just have no idea one way or the other, or I don't want to say one way or the other. I'm too uncertain to take a clear position, or it could be, it couldn't be, and I don't want to say, kind of thing. What is it for you?
It's hard for me to fully flesh it out without sounding like a hippie stoner, but it's just I
don't know why anyone would think of that about you, Chris.
There's a lot of times that I find it hard to see God, but then there's other moments where it hits me and I'm just like, what is behind, like, where does the universe end and what's behind that? I mean, this is where it gets out there. I don't know how to really put it in words yet.
Well, it's damn it. I'm sorry. I know I'm getting sick. So I'm trying to fight back these coughs. I guess for me, this is I look at these kinds of questions under the framework of induction, that we are making essentially best guesses about the nature of our reality, but we understand we're limited because we don't have perfect knowledge of that reality, and so we could be wrong in the conclusions that we make, and I'm very comfortable with that. So when I say I don't believe any gods exist, you can say, well, you're really saying no gods exist. I say, yeah, I don't think any gods exist, like no gods. And they're like, well, prove it. How can you prove it without knowing all of everything? So, well, you take the claims and you stack that against, the evidence for those claims. If they're less than likely to be true, it's safe to conclude that they're false, with the understanding that you could be wrong. You just don't have any reason to think that that's the case.
Provisional,
provisionally, right? That it's not saying this isn't, because I didn't come up with a deductive argument to say absolutely God categorically not exist because there's some logical contradiction in his actions and attributes, blah blah blah. You don't have to do all of that, to my mind. You can just say, based on what's available to me, I see those claims as false, and for that reason, I'm concluding that no gods exist. To me, that's the beginning and end. Like, you don't have to, and the whole apologetic, counter argument against that of like, oh, what, it's almost, and not to pin that on you, but like, what's behind the universe, or what was there before the universe began, and how could the universe, how could the cosmos be eternal, and blah blah blah. Like, I don't know these things. I don't know.
Ask a cosmologist, right?
Right. Yeah. Ask a cosmologist. Sure. Like, I'm only dealing with what's in front of me, and what's in front of me leads me to conclude that the things that people are professing are false when it comes to theistic beliefs. So I have to conclude that those false beliefs are corresponding accurately with reality, and the gods that they're professing just aren't there. And in America and the West, we're talking about the Christian God. We're talking about the Abrahamic God, that he's not there. I'm happy to have my mind changed by that. But that's going to require evidence. Evidence is not going to be your argument using math. That's going to X, Y, and then parentheses, and this is therefore God at the end of it. You've just obfuscated the issue. And I've said, and Chris, yeah, I think I said this once, and I can't remember. It was like the Reasonable Faith Debunk group or whatever. Someone's like, well, what would convince you if God exists? Blah, blah, blah. The you angry atheist, whatever. I was like, well, God can come meet me at the pub. I'll buy him the first round. I don't care. He can encounter with me. He can interact with me. And that would change my mind, because he's giving me clear evidence of his own existence, and not some gobbledygook argument. Which is why I take the whole enterprise just like less seriously day by day when I think about apologetics.
Well, I think there's also a lot of good arguments for why the God of classical theism, at least, cannot exist. Any being that's described as omnipotent, omniscient, and all benevolent. Let's just, for an example, take omniscience, all-knowing. Is God conscious? If he's a conscious being, that means that there is an experience of what it would be like to be God, right?
Right.
Well, if that's the case, then God could, upload that experience onto our consciousness and cause us to believe that we are God. That's possible. And if that's possible, so too is it possible for God to be essentially us, with that consciousness uploaded to him. So there really is, God, even God can't know that he's not a brain in a vat. It's just a problem that goes along with being conscious, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's not to, I guess, refer to what I said just briefly. Like, it's not that there aren't strong deductive arguments, against the existence of God. It's just, I don't, for my own, and it's not that subjective experience, whatever, like my own perspective on it, I'll say that, you don't even have to go there. You can go there. And I think those are interesting thought experiments. And that's, to bring it back to capturing Christianity, it's essentially what I said is, they're bringing up these things again. They provide to me, sort of an interesting armchair philosophy. I like exploring and working through the arguments, but they're essentially the same arguments, right? Essentially the same rehash. But yes, those deductive arguments exist. I do enjoy playing around with them from time to time. The consciousness one is an interesting. I've never heard that version of it, actually. That you could be uploaded with an F God's omnipotent, right? To be uploaded with his omniscient thought and not realize and still be a brain of that. So God doesn't even know if he's God. Essentially, it's possible that God doesn't even know that he's God, or that he's not God. I don't know how do you break that down?
Yeah, even if there actually is a God,
Right.
He doesn't know. He can't know with certainty that he's that God.
That's That's interesting to me. But yeah, there are, and again, this is armchair philosophy. These are fun arguments. I do like to explore them. So I do think that's cool. Thank you for bringing that. It's going to be something to mull
I don't
over
take
for a
it that
while.
seriously myself,
Well,
but I
right, because
just
it's all armchair
but
shit,
they
right?
exist. There's just as many arguments against that we could use if we're going to play that game.
Right. It's, there are arguments for, there's arguments against. There obviously are deductive arguments for, like we were talking about before we went on, like William Lane Craig, and a lot of his arguments that are essentially, he's got the moral argument and so on. That these are intended as deductive arguments that if you are accepting those premises, that therefore the conclusion, God exists, you have to accept if you're agreeing with the premises. But he plays word games and what have you. Ben, do you want to touch on that a little bit? I gotta run to the room
Word
just real
games. I
quick.
think the best example of that is probably the modal ontological argument, and Cameron on capturing Christianity. Actually, this was one of the times that I kind of owned him. I just basically explained in the comments, this is just trying to define God into existing. And he's like, well, where? Sorry there. I really apologize to our viewers. My internet is just shoddy, and I didn't plan for this. What was the last thing that you guys heard?
What did I can't tell you what was he saying. I was into it. Hang on, I don't remember.
But the whole argument, though, is trying to basically define God into existing. They define God as maximally great, then they define maximal greatness as, well, then he would have to exist, otherwise he wouldn't be maximally great. That's shorthand, basically.
Hey, hang on one second. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
How are we doing here?
Reasonable enough.
Oh, we got one viewer again. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and they hung on through all that fiasco.
Yeah,
I don't know what that fiasco was, but sorry, one viewer. I wonder if it's
out. I had to take a pause for a second.
Oh, really? You took a minute. You went out and came back.
I had to talk to my wife's having to run.
I wonder if it's Dennis is watching us now. Maybe he said because he was going to join us. We had another friend, Dennis, who we sort of talked through some of these arguments with. He was not able to join us this time, but we might do this again. This is fun.
Yeah, Dennis. Yeah,
it's nice to I like kind of having these talks where I don't have to like put on a show necessarily, where it's like it has to be all polished and professional. I'm just basically shooting the shit. And hope not too many people are paying attention because I'm sure a lot of things I could say could be picked apart and used against me. But maybe I've got that coming. Who knows? But where were we in the conversation before I stepped out?
Ontological argument.
Yeah, the modal ontological argument that it's to me the baseline of that is they're the apologist is finding a way to word game God into existence, which strikes me as just on its face like a reification fallacy. And they have ways of like taking you down the primrose path essentially long enough and with enough words to make it sound like that's not what they're doing. But like if you pull back and just examine the totality of the thing from start to finish, like that seems very much like still what they're doing, even though that's, it was sort of like Ari, what you were saying about like William Lane Craig and a lot of his arguments of like A, therefore B. And then he talks extensively about A, and then he talks extensively about B. And somewhere in there, when you're 45 minutes in, he switched to B, therefore A, and you didn't really notice it because he was saying all these reasonable things before, and he was using all these big words, right? And and you're kind of going along with it. You didn't quite catch the changeover. So now we're saying B, therefore A, and he's made a fallacious argument, and he's polished that up so nicely that it takes a very sharp mind to pick up on it in order to expose that. And that's really sort of the center of what counter apologetics is all about. It is taking, is looking past the rhetoric, looking past the fancy language, looking past the posturing essentially of the argument, and taking a look at what they're really saying and whether or not there is some fundamental flaw with it. And that's why I like counter apologetics, because that's essentially what I try to do when I'm presented with these kinds of things.
Man, do you guys ever notice a pattern? This is see if you guys agree. The atheist, secular side tends to break down the arguments to the more lay, but they don't dumb it down completely, but they seek the simplest terminology and the most clear, concise points, whereas apologists tend to I swear they are obfuscating. I mean, it's the biggest words they can get a hold of to give them credibility. It's like they need to build themselves up with something.
Well, yeah, I think sometimes it's an attempt to sound, erudite and sophisticated. Sometimes, like, I've been accused of this myself a lot, of like, I'm the guy that uses the $4 words and what have you. And I try to get away from that as much as possible, or at least interact on, to come to whoever I'm talking to, whoever my interlocutor is, I'm trying to come to where they're at. So if they're not familiar with a bunch of philosophy jargon, if I'm pulling out the Latin essentially and using that to tell them why they're wrong, I just sound like I'm trying to talk down to them, right? And the fact, and I'm going to look like to an observer that I'm winning the argument just because they can't keep up with what I'm saying because they're not familiar with the vocabulary, right? And we're not the only ones that do this. I'm not the only one who's been guilty of that. But I became aware of it sort of just over time of interacting with people, because I decided at some point along the line, I'm not just trying to win. I'm really trying to get through to whoever I'm talking to, or at least whoever's. And if I just sound like some snide, elitist, I don't want to say college educated, because everyone should be college educated, but like the idea that I'm talking down to a less educated person, appealing to my education as a power play in the conversation, that's some slime ball shit, right? I shouldn't do it. I've done it, and I try not to do it now. So I try to find the simplest way to explain it. Like, if someone has, input a fallacious argument, I'm not going to say you've done, the fallacy of da da da, whatever it is in Latin, right? Because that doesn't mean anything to them, and I just sound like I'm talking down to them. I say you said this, but what it sounds like when you're saying this sounds like to me what you're expressing at that point in time, and there's an issue with it, and talk about what the issue is instead of just playing fallacy whack-a-mole. And I think that's a better way of talking to people. But a lot of times apologists, and not just in the back and forth debate, but in the presentation of the argument, I think what you were saying is that it's dressed up enough that most regular people walking down the street are going to have to bust out the Google and the dictionary to understand what the fuck it was that he said, to figure out if anything's wrong with it in the first place. So you're already backpedaling, right? And that becomes the force of the argument, is the fact that it's esoteric and elite. And it's not really coming to people where they're at, because you're trying to persuade them. You're trying to win.
If you don't mind, it's not so much the big words that bother me. If you use big words use big words. It's more when I see people like William Lane Craig deliberately trying to cover up fallacies, which
Sure.
betrays the fact that they know that they exist. Here's a case example: debate on the existence of God. He gives invariably one of his five arguments is the resurrection of Jesus, and he'll say, Jesus' resurrection is evidence for the God hypothesis. And then you'll go on and counter argue why you don't believe the resurrection. And he'll say something. Let me know if you've heard this. He'll say something like, well, I would agree with you that a natural resurrection is improbable, but that's not the hypothesis. The hypothesis is that God rose Jesus from the dead. Well, thank you, Dr. Craig. Now you've just completely rendered your argument circular and hence invalid, so we can pretend it doesn't exist. Because he's saying, the resurrection, ergo God. But resurrection, how do we know that? Well, the hypothesis is that God did it. But God raised Jesus from the dead, therefore God exists. It's circular.
Right. No, I get that. And that's why, in those cases, and in a lot of the little topics we've had in our little private chat, I always come back to it, show me the evidence that I don't want to call myself an evidentialist necessarily, because like you get saddlebagged with things. Oh, you're an evidentialist, so therefore, here's this problem kind of thing. But like, if you're trying to tell me a person came back from the dead, you need to give me good reasons to believe that actually happened. And not that it's consistent with the hypothesis of God. Like I said, and sort of smuggle it in back and forth, like William Wayne, that Craig does in those kinds of arguments, like you're pointing out. We were having a conversation the other day, and someone correct my memory on this, but basically, sort of like defining God as like the greatest possible good kind of thing, and this comes back to the ontological argument that. Oh, I wish Dennis was here because it was more his hobby horse than mine. But like, essentially saying, well, because you've defined a thing, as having the characteristics of X, Y, Z, that doesn't mean you're actually describing anything in reality. You're just simply offering the definition. That doesn't do anything. It doesn't mean anything. Like I could define David as 12 feet tall. That doesn't. I don't grow because I've offered that definition and I'm adhering strictly to that definition. It doesn't make me 12 feet tall. So defining God as, the greatest possible good, that he's morally perfect, omniscient, omnipotent, all these other things. Like, it doesn't mean you're corresponding that definition with anything that's in reality at all. So like, when I hear that, and when you guys see this, that's where I always go, is like, show me how that corresponds to something that you could demonstrate to be true in reality. That's where I'm always going to go with it.
I'm afraid it's much worse than that. They define it as God's nature. God's nature is good.
Right.
Okay, so then that just means God is God. Then that's what that reduces to. If God's nature
it's even more like God is goodness itself, kind of thing, with regards to morality, and that relates to divine command theory and their sort of basis for what they call objective morality, which I'll go there in a second. But like, if God is goodness, if God is, an adjective that we use to describe things, there's no qualitative, input as to what that is. It's just like saying God is like God without ever saying, what God is or what godness is, because we're saying God is goodness. And so when we say a thing is like God being good, we're not actually describing it at all.
Right. Which is true if you want to define it that way.
But we have
want to say that God is good itself.
But we have an independent definition of what goodness is, right? We use that, qualitatively, of saying what is good and what is not good. And we're just that's the apologists just smuggling that onto God.
And then they equivocate good as if good meant something external from that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's and I'm obviously not the first person or the smartest person to point out that flaw. I think it was. I know I've seen it in Wielenberg's work because he tries to lay out sort of a non-theistic moral realism He has a paper that's like, I don't know, 20 pages long. Came out like I think sometime in the 90s, and he's updated it and stuff because it was responded to by Craig. But he talks about that. Basically, you're evacuating, content to the term good by using it that way. But in reality, we don't. But like if we're going to adhere to the apologetic definitions, then it really wouldn't have any meaning. But we just don't live that way.
Wielenberg is I'm really interested in him. Just recently discovered him, and I've listened to that debate several times, and I continue to because I ain't gonna lie.
And Craig, that was a good one.
It takes me time to digest to really try to let it understand what's being said.
It's hefty stuff.
And I'm still trying to understand Wielenberg's. Like I get the gist, and I think I understand it, but I still am trying to replay, especially when he goes into the psychopath part. That stuff is fascinating with me. Anyway, that's been a hobby of mine in the last few years, just learning
psychopaths,
just in cluster Bs in general, and then what it applies to Christianity, especially to my raising with Calvinism. It's like that means God created people that are broken. Basically, they're tigers. Right. I mean, and how do you blame a tiger for tigering?
Yeah, they don't have the, because where they say that we've had sort of the law written on our hearts kind of thing. A person who is a psychopath certainly does not, right? That's obvious. And I guess to me, there's sort of the obvious look of that, of saying, well, if it's supposed to be written on all of our hearts, it's clearly not written on theirs. Therefore, what you're saying is false. But a lot of times there's an apologetic defense for everything, right? And if you really want to believe the apologetic defense, that's the way you're going to go. Again, this comes down to motivated reasoning, but that, an apologist could say that, that law is still written on their hearts, but because they're so depraved, essentially they're just choosing to, ignore it from the very start, essentially, even though that doesn't really pan out, comparably to other people, because then everybody should be a psychopath, right? Who's not a saved Christian. But like, that's still going to work with people who want to believe it's true.
The science just doesn't back that up. And that's the thing I notice. Like guys like Cameron need to spend a little more time with science on psychology and get up to date. And not that I am no expert by this, but like, listen to, have you guys ever seen Dr. Robert Sapolsky at Stanford? Incredible.
It sounds familiar, but I don't know.
Fascinating stuff. You guys got to check him out. He's a PhD and he's at Stanford. And his talks on the brain, and not just his, there's plenty of others about your prefrontal cortex. And you guys all know this case, right, of Phineas Cage?
Yes.
So let's take
the severing of the corpus callosum, yeah.
Yeah. So from that point on, the guy did not possess the ability.
Ben, are you still with us?
I am. I was just listening.
I couldn't tell if you were just.
Are you
just
referring to the
super intent, or if you fell out again?
Split the hemispheres. One side can believe in God, and the other one rejects God. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that's all tied in. That's where I'm going. But the case in the railroad worker in the 1800s, Phineas Cage, had a railroad spike blasted through his skull on accident in an accident on the job, and he survived miraculously, but he was never the same. He was this nice, highly respected foreman of the railroad, get it done, reliable, go to church, disciplined God type man, married, and he went to being divorced, out of church, temperamental, could not keep a job.
I think he eventually died of an infection related to that. But for however long he lived after that, he basically was like Jekyll and Hyde. And he was just a jackass apparently, and just a complete shift in his personality.
But he still worked jobs, and he still was tolerable, and he could read and think and process. He could live and function, but he really lost ability to control, to have happy thought. I think he lost happiness basically. Pretty fascinating. That's just one example, but then the stuff you brought up, Ben, about I'm still trying to learn more about that. I've seen that video with the doctor that gives that lecture.
I think it was The Moral Landscape. Sam Harris, he talked about that a little bit.
But you guys have seen the actual doctor that did that study, though, right? That did the.
I wouldn't know.
He's an Indian guy, but he's a real medical doctor, and he on patients like they have split some of that brain stuff in studies, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and I think I kind of get what you're going with. That is like, yeah, if you fuck up or damage certain parts of the brain, you're gonna impact how the mind functions, right, or its ability to function.
Absolutely.
Also, and if there's supposed to be, this again, because we were talking before I started the broadcast about like substance dualism and the mind body distinction, what have you, like the physical versus the theists, to my understanding, generally believe that the consciousness, the soul is those that's where it comes from essentially, is the soul. So if that's the case, what you do to someone's physical brain shouldn't affect really their person, right?
Mhm.
But that's clearly the case. We have mountains of evidence of that.
It's just a reification of the mind as a thing, when really it's not a noun, it's a verb. It's just a process. It's what the
Right.
brain does. Digestion is what the stomach does, but we
Right.
call it digestion.
Yeah. It's cognition. That's what the brain does.
We have numerous examples. I forget the man's name in America. I think it was America or some European country who developed a tumor over his prefrontal, something in the front of the brain. And over time started having these crazy thoughts, went to a therapist, tried to tell him, and then within months killed his whole family. And then upon his autopsy, he had a massive tumor growing and pressing on a portion of his brain, and it was causing him. He was not himself.
Yeah.
Guys, Google that if you're not familiar with it. The details are really legit, and it's well documented in the medical community.
It's interesting, and I think again we were talking about this before we came on, before you were able to join the call. That some of the most interesting and maybe the most ad hoc kind of response to issues like this is this what is it, like quantum non-realism or whatever. And there's again on my podcast, like early January, we had a guy came on, quasi famous YouTuber Johanna Ratz, is a big proponent of this and is sort of worked in coordination with, I think it's like Inspiring Philosophy and some other people who promote the idea that essentially, well, physical reality isn't real. So if you have a tumor on your brain, or you get a railroad spike shot through your head, and it affects your personality, that's actually just because reality isn't real, and we all just exist in the simulation or something like that in the mind of God. That because there is no actual physical reality, that's just a thing that's essentially happened to your avatar in God's mind game. As a way of avoiding, we're saying we're correlating it wrongly by looking at physical reality, supposedly correlating to this, the mind, consciousness, the immaterial, that we've got it backwards, and there's actually no physical reality. It's just, to me, it jumps the shark entirely, just because it's unparsimonious and
not what most scientists believe either.
And not what most scientists believe either. Not what any actual quantum physicist that I know of promotes. And it was.
But this guy tries to say that.
Not to speak ill of Johanna, but it was his defense against that. That like, well, these guys are basically out of sort of their scientific snobbery, are refusing to examine the philosophical implications of their work. Is I think how he put it. If I can, and I don't remember the episode number. I guess it was season 2, episode 1, actually, or 2 maybe. Way back in January, we had this guy on, and he talked to us, for myself and my co-host, for like better part of 2 hours, going through all of this. And we went through the better part of a bottle of bourbon, listening to him talk about it, because it was just so batshit on its face, right? Like, and it can be defended, right? And he went into an entire spiel about it, of how it can be possible because of look at these different tests they do in quantum physics and what it suggests to him and what have you. But like, it just to me it just fails a basic level of credibility, that all of our thoughts and perceptions and everything is just false, and we just don't know that. And while it works in a way similar to like solipsism, right? That it's potentially true, right? But the odds of that are so bad because it's such a particularly put together, conundrum essentially and thought experiment that no one really takes it seriously. Theist, non-theist, anybody. I don't know anybody who really takes that as a serious line. That they should change how they look at reality because, well, everybody I'm interacting with, those are just products of my mind, and I can do with them as I please. We tend to lock those people away.
What if people acted like that was true?
Right. Nobody acts like that's true. Nobody who's not in a padded cell somewhere. So yeah, and I look at that in a similar way. But I guess Chris, sort of back to you. It's like, yeah, I agree. I think that presents really clear problems that are just sort of danced around, and that's sort of a theme, isn't it? That
yeah. And go ahead, no.
I was gonna say, yeah, it's just like the Old Testament atrocities, or or Euthyphro, or all these things. There is a way to push back when you have an entire career field and industry devoted to pushing back against what seems like the obvious problems with theism, with Christianity in particular, and the beliefs that they profess. You have to undercut all of our sort of evidence producing mechanisms, right? Whether or not we're talking about our own brains and our ability to apprehend physical reality, to scientific institutions and the scientific method, we see these things being undercut all the time. I saw some. And it was published by, I think it was like either the Federalist Society or National Review, basically saying that there were certain, within certain fields, the studies that come out and they're supposed to be peer reviewed, right? And it shows how people intentionally put through like spurious studies that are just completely false and bullshit if anybody was to even read the titles of these studies. And somehow they made it through peer review because there's some system where you pay money and they'll just push it through and it doesn't matter and it'll end up in a scientific journal somewhere, right? Because that can happen. Therefore, we shouldn't really take peer review seriously. That's the argument it's suggesting, right? So it's the attempt to undercut our ways of ascertaining, reality, and to reduce our level of confidence in those things, so that then there's more breathing room for theistic thought and argument. And that seems like a consistent behavior. Again, we're going to bring this back to taking pot shots at capturing Christianity. That they do this a lot with regards to their arguments about scientism.
Are you talking about scientism, bro?
Yeah, scientism. So, and I want this to be the last topic because we've been at this a little while and I'm tired. But yeah, the thing about scientism, and I'll say this and I'll let you guys chime in. I'll let you. I encourage you guys to chime in. Sorry, I'm a shot caller when I do these. I do like these panel discussions. And if I let other people start and talk as much as they want, they never shut the hell up. And I've got to go to the next person because there could be 6 or 7 people, and we don't want people talking over people. We want the conversation to flow and it to be interesting. So like I direct traffic a little bit, and I can get a little bit, I don't know, come off a little, I don't know, officious maybe. But the thing about scientism, basically the argument is that people who are engaged in scientism treat science essentially as the end all be all of everything, and the only way to have knowledge of the world, and it's the only thing that's important. Right. And it's either science or bust, baby. And it's, and it puts this on, which to me, it's a canard, because I don't know very many people who actually think about science that way, that, that we don't need philosophy. We don't need, we just have science, and it's all science all day long. Science, and ignoring the fact that there are other ways to coming, to know things that don't engage in the scientific process, that science itself is, part of, is a philosophy, that there are philosophical underpinnings to the scientific method, and that's why we use it the way we use it. And it's a tool to eliminate our biases so that we can understand the world as best we can. That's what science really does. But that gets ignored, because so that when you're talking to people like the Captain Christianity folks or other apologists, you bring up science. You're saying, well, your Bible says this, whatever. And then science says that. And they go, oh, you're engaged in scientism, da 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 da. Like, and they go into this bullshit, but like nobody really holds the position that I know of. And if they do, and when I do see that they do, they say, well, science is the best thing around. Like, our lives run on science. We're using fucking technology right now that is products of science. Like, we need it. It's all day, every day. It is science. But we understand that, like, yeah, that's not everything. But like, dude, it's maybe one of the most important things.
Think about the audacity of the internet apologists to use science to talk shit about science.
Right. And that's what it is. And they'll say that science is good, but it has its place right next to my bullshit, that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge, essentially, to quote, Isaac Asimov. And I think that's what they're doing, and it's a way to saddlebag and undermine, the legitimacy of, scientific pursuits.
Because they can't compete with it.
Yes, exactly.
So they try to dumb science down to the level where they're on an even playing field. But the thing about scientism, the belief that science is the be all end all, the only proper way of knowing anything. I don't know any scientists who hold that view. This is purely a word used by people trying to sell you bullshit.
Well, Lawrence Krauss probably.
Maybe, but I think most scientists have a decent sensibility about them.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. I think Krauss had some sort of maybe inflated thing that he said about science, and it was quoted and used as sort of a defense of that he had sort of an inflated thing that he said about science, and it's being sort of used. Look at him, Lawrence Krauss engaged in scientism, blah blah blah. Look at these guys. If you're an atheist, if you're a whatever, you're engaged in scientism, and here's all the problems with scientism, and it's your fault. So back away from science now. Like that's they're not saying that explicitly, but that's I think, to my mind, strongly implied. It'd be really fantastic to have an actual like Christian apologist to push back on these things, because
yeah.
We're a little echo chambery here, but a
little bit.
I feel like we're on point, especially with this one. And that's, again, I do the podcast for Running Opinions, the show, and that I try to encourage differing opinions to come on and talk about things like that. So like maybe we do another one of these, we can find someone who is a Christian or an apologist type individual who would want to push back in a civil way. We would also probably have to fix some of our rhetoric.
Yeah. Well, I would. I mean, and I do talk a lot of shit, but in person, I'd love to have real discussions in person. Like, I don't go into emotional rants and stuff. Like, I try to. But yeah, you're right. But I mean, you get on Facebook and these groups, and some guys are real genuine, and you can tell it. But then when someone like Cameron has a snark to him from the start and talks down to me, which he did, it's just like, okay, like F you. Like, I mean, I'm not taking you. You're not in this for God. You're in this to puff your ego up, you asswipe.
Yeah.
Nailed it. Yeah.
Nailed it. Yeah. I like you said that. And it's I need to have another discussion with Ben Watkins, because they get along. He was just I didn't actually watch it, but he was recently on another show with them, and he debating some topic, whatever. But he said more than once that they're good friends. And I find myself like, it won't be secret now, but secretly wondering like if he's playing nice because he needs interlocutors to interact with that have a platform, or if he really sees something in guys like Cameron that I just don't, because I see some of the shittiness, and that's where I've turned my attention to, and I don't realize that maybe there is something sincere about him, because honestly I'd like there to be something sincere about him.
Well, Ben is I met Ben through Capturing Christianity and one or two other pages, and he accepted my friend request. I don't know him.
Right.
I love his post. I love his thoughts. He's
He does the
definitely
Relay Theology podcast.
yeah, and I love that. I'm a fan, and he's definitely more intelligent than I am, and I do. He does give me pause sometimes because he is good with Cameron and guys like that, and so it makes me try to be subjective and go, well, maybe you're the main asshole, Chris, but at
Right.
the same time, Ben comes across. I don't know. I'm guessing Ben comes across as such a good guy that
Yeah.
he tries to only see good, and I've come from such a more skeptical background, and guys like Cameron, the way I see him is if you're a crony, but you pay homage to him, you're
Right.
good, but
You'll get
stay
a
in your
pass,
place.
basically.
If you're above him, he needs you. He needs to get. It's not so much like he need. It's like you're his peer. He knows he can't cross you yet, but he's working his way to try to do
Right.
that.
Yeah, that's it's interesting with that because like I said, I don't know Ben like we're best buddies or anything like that. I've interacted with him a few times. I met him in person, I think the first time. It was the Last Reason rally in like 2015 or 6. I can't remember the last time they did one, but in DC on the mall there in front of like the Lincoln Memorial, they get a big atheist gathering essentially. And it's, they have speakers like Bill Nye and who have, what have you. And I ran into it was back before Relay Theology had started. It was Justin Schieber and Ben were just there hanging out, and myself and a couple other people just ended up, we had a little crowd that we walked around with and just walked and talked and greeted people that we had met like from the internet basically. And it's like, hey, you're a real person, shake your hand, we'll talk about things, and it was cool. And that's how I got to know him. And then, I see his posts and follow his posts, particularly with regards to politics, actually, more than philosophy. And like, yeah, like I said, I ended up having on my podcast a couple of times. Like he's an eminently nice dude. And maybe he's just not reading the bad intentions that we are in these guys. I don't know. But yeah, but when it comes to regards to Cameron, I do think he's really just trying to increase his notoriety. And obviously he's a Christian. Obviously he believes that. But like, I don't know if he really, I don't think he thinks about atheists with regards to what he's doing. I think he's thinking about, defending and protecting and galvanizing fellow Christians in this modern world, essentially. Because a lot of it comes, and I can't remember which one of it amongst our little group. We talk about like he, I think he had a sibling or a cousin or something that would become an atheist, and he would have these debates with him. And from what it sounds like, not do very well, and so it caused him to delve into apologetics so he can learn how to do better. And it's because, deep down he has an intuition or belief that he's really, really right. And he's just not necessarily good at the arguments. And that's fair. You could be right in whatever your position is and just not be as well versed in, in the arguments, in the rhetoric and all the background research that you have to get into in order to defend, such a huge, side essentially in this argument, because there's so many elements and aspects to it. Again, it's a whole career field that you can explore.
If I would have remained a Christian, there's no doubt I would be doing what Cameron's doing. It'd be a different style, but I would be trying to be like that. And I think I see that from the bat, and that's what I think caused me to latch onto the page and watch it. And I've shared I've helped it grow a little bit too.
Right.
But yeah, it's like this weird fascination because I'm watching it, but I saw the snark come through, and it just really kind of flicked the switch in me.
It's too much.
Was like,
yeah.
There's, and I won't be able to quote it directly. I have it somewhere, but Plutarch, one of his favorite quotes of mine, and again, I can only paraphrase it, is basically sort of in the manner and the use of your speech, you can derive the intent of the speaker, right? You can the intent and the disposition of the speaker, basically. And I think I'm pretty good at that myself. That when you can read if someone is trying to be sincere with you, if someone's trying to be respectful, or if they're trying to slag you off and and score points, on Facebook or or just be an asshat in general. What, you know, you can read the motivations of somebody in the way they use language. So when someone is using on purpose big flowery words that aren't necessary, right? It's because they're trying to sound smarter than you, right? And talk down to you. Sometimes those are the best words to use in those situations, right? Sometimes if you already know the person understands entirely the vocabulary that you're using, that's not a thing. I can sit and talk about it's this fallacy, it's that fallacy with you guys. I'm not talking down to you when I do that. But if I'm talking to someone who doesn't understand that terminology and I'm using that as leverage in the conversation. I sort of touched on this earlier. Like, these are the things that you can read in somebody. So like when somebody like Alejandro, you know, busts out the math problems to prove God exists, like, he's trying to use the fact that it's esoteric and not many people can interact with what he's doing in order to talk down. Cameron, I think, does similar things. Not necessarily the math problem. That's being just slightly hyperbolic. But, you know, I read ill intent, you know, and I try to hope that I'm not wrong about that. I feel like I need to have a follow-up conversation with Ben sometime. And he can tell me what he really thinks about it.
But like, take this for example, like the Inspiring Philosophy.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of that page. And I think I don't agree with a lot of the stuff. And it makes me like want to give rebuttals in a crazy way, but it's not personal. And I don't sense snark. And he allows unbelievers to almost reign freely as long as you don't drop F-bombs everywhere on the page, you know, like,
right.
And you look at the numbers and you see why. I mean, respect, and his content's really well done. It's like Cameron has to create an unlevel playing field to even have a shot. Like, he's ran almost all atheists out, except for a handful. Like,
unless they're people like Ben who they're trained philosophers and they're people that they have to respect.
Spencer Hawkins.
Yeah, I like Spencer too. I don't think I've ever directly interacted with him. I don't think Spencer, but I do like a lot of his work. Yeah.
I feel like he would let stupid atheists roam freely too, if they made Christianity look good just by being stupid.
Oh, if you're like the equivalent of a young Earth atheist,
there's stupid people in both camps. It's not that there's no stupid atheists. Of course, they're out there, and
of course,
if they're on his page, I'm sure he's going to let them stay on.
Right? Because
have you guys noticed?
Go ahead.
Have you guys noticed how embarrassed he gets when young Earth Christians get on there sincerely positing their belief? Like, you can tell he gets real.
But he doesn't want to tell them no either. Yeah.
Yeah, he can't. He can't do it biblically. He can't just shut them out. But he's like, guys, you're embarrassing me in front of all my cool philosophy friends.
Right. Yeah, they're not going to take you seriously. Yeah, it's, you know, but he doesn't want to turn away, you know, potential followers, people who are going to help.
It's that conundrum.
Help him grow his thing. But like, I don't know, what do they say? You know, like big minds talk about ideas and small minds talk about people. Like, to a certain extent, like, I don't want to just, and it's our therapy session, but like, to, you know, just constantly, it's not about, to me, Cameron in particular, it's about the kind of personality that's drawn to apologetics and why so many of them are so bad they end up being repulsive to everybody else who's not in the camp. And I think that's sort of like, if there's a meta message to all of this, is that, like, we see, or at least perceive, you know, what kind of game is being played here, and we're not buying it. And it makes Christianity in general, and it makes apologetics in general look real bad, and it's very unflattering. You want to say something? I heard.
Sorry. I was going to say, like, and to try to put a little charity here, there's a Christian crowd that I do still respect and follow sincerely. Sure. And Tim Keller, Mike Licona. I even like Gary Habermas. I don't agree with some of his stuff on the resurrection, but I really like him. There's several others, but the ones he associates with, like Tim McGrew, William Lane Craig, they're the most slippery. I don't want to call them slimy, so I don't want to take it that personal. Because on one hand, I'd have a beer with all these guys, but I do like. It seems like McGrew and William Lane Craig just seem to duck and dodge, and they're politicians, to me, for Christianity. That's what they are. They're just.
And we have them too. Like
that's true.
Like Pete Boghossian. Like, I don't I'm not a fan of his approach, even slightly a little bit. Like his book, which again, I like street epistemology in general. I like sort of the principles that they follow, more or less, that they're trying to be more Socratic and more approachable and just try to have a conversation about beliefs and what motivates them rather than like attack. Yeah, you're wrong. I have to prove you wrong. But like, because he wrote a book called A Manual for Creating Atheists, like you've automatically put a bullseye in your head. You've automatically said, I'm here to fight people who disagree with me. And a lot of his rhetoric follows from that. Again, this is some number of years ago at this point. He's changed some things. He's also said some other things in the meantime that are not particularly flattering to him, I think. But like, if you come in there, again, back to the Plutarch quote, like if you come into this for the intentions only of galvanizing your side, it's going to be real obvious, that he didn't write a manual for creating atheists because he wants theists to understand him, right? And to me, that's a fundamental problem in discourse generally.
To be charitable, I think that had more to do with the publisher.
Yeah.
I really don't think he wanted to title his book that way, but no one's going to buy a book called Street Epistemology. So
that's fair to an extent. I can speak to that.
But he has acted in the way that you speak, though. I've seen him.
I've seen some of his rhetoric, and it comports with that, even if he didn't pick that title. And I can speak it just slightly in sympathy. I don't anymore. It's been a number of years now. That I used to write like letters to the editor for my local newspaper, and there's not a single one of those that made it on paper with the title that I gave it. They always gave it something else that I guess they thought would sell better, essentially, or would be a little bit more sensational, or cleaned up maybe in some cases. But like not a single one. And I wrote, I don't know, maybe probably 24 at tops, like my whole life, that I'd ever written that made it in the paper. Not a single one of any of those ever had the same title that I gave it, like even a little bit. So I can sympathize just slightly with that. But
I gotta go, guys, with that. But,
yeah, I gotta go too. I think it's a good place to wrap.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, Ben and Chris, thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining. This is a fun little jaunt. But you guys take care, and we should do this again soon.
Sure,
Definitely.
Sure. Welcome it.
All right, you guys.
Bye.
I'm gonna stop.